For years, there has always been an argument around whether or not AMD's RX 480 series was a better buy than the AMD Fury line of cards, with them being available at used prices very similar to each other for years, virtually from their launch actually. But now, after nearly a decade battling out on the used market, just what was the better option, and what happens in 2025 when you throw them both up against each other? So just what are the differences between the two cards? Well, for today's sake, we are going to be comparing using the R9 Nano because that's the AMD Fury card I've got on hand, but don't worry, I did test with the add-in board version, which is the version that sells for anywhere from £25 to £50, similar price range to the RX 480, but we're going to be using the R9 Nano because that's the one I've got on hand. The cards do actually share quite a few similarities. When it comes to architecture, the RX 480 is based on GCN4, whereas the R9 Nano and the rest of the Fury series is based on GCN3, and there's quite a lot of overlap between the two and what they actually get feature-wise, but GCN4 tends to be a little bit newer and has a few more features that mean it does better in DirectX 12 and Vulkan. Both do relatively well, keep in mind. The biggest difference is, though, our RX 480 has 8GB of GDDR5 VRAM, whereas the Nano series, along with the rest of the Fury cards, only ever got 4GB of admittedly rather decent HBM memory. This in turn comes with a monumentally big 4096-bit memory bus, which dwarfs the 256-bit memory bus of the RX 480. When it actually comes to raw power though and cores, the RX 480 only has around half the amount of the Fury series, which is why it was always so impressive back in the day that people were even having this conversation, because 2,304 cores against 4,096 seems absolutely ridiculous. But there are some architectural changes that Polaris? How do I actually pronounce this? But I can't say Polaris because then people comment. It's Polaris, there we go, we'll go with that one. Polaris tends to actually perform better with the shaders it has, given it's a more modern architecture, but they're both available on the used market for a similar price. You can grab a Fury, depending on condition, for around £30 upwards, and the same goes for the RX 480. So the question is, in 2025, despite some big differences on paper, how do they actually compete with each other? As I just said though, we did actually incorporate the add-in board version, the cheap Fury, into this because it made sense, because really the Nano is a bit of a niche item and the Fury X is getting rare now, so really when we are comparing this, we're comparing against the big chunky old AMD Fury cards against the newer RX 480 cards. And in reality, between a lot of the Fury series now, from my testing, there was around 2% difference, give or take. It was very, very small. There's architectural problems that make up more of a difference than the actual core limits between them. So the footage you're going to be seeing today is taken from the R9 Nano, because I really like that little card, but keep in mind, doesn't matter what Fury card you're using, you'll probably see around 2% better if you use a Fury X and 2% worse if you use an add-in board version, with the Nano sitting somewhere in the middle. There is really a very thin performance margin on Fury cards now, but it's worth keeping that in mind. So why are we making this video? Well, it's an argument that has been happening for years. Genuinely, for years there has always been the question of, do you buy an RX 480 or do you buy an AMD Fury card, especially in the budget section of the market? And now, 9 years on, we are seeing them enter what is bargain bin territory, where for the £25 to £50 region, you are literally looking at these cards, which is ridiculous because this was the same argument we were having when both were available on the used market for 100 to 150. Just now they're in bargain bin territory and no one's bothered looking at both of them together in about probably 7 years. Now, there are special versions of the Fury like the Nano or the X, as we covered, which will cost you more, but there's very little performance to be gained by going with them. And then again, you've also got on the RX 480 side, they've got the non-reference versions that'll also set you back a little bit more, so it's pretty fair on both sides. Around the launch of the RX 400 line of cards back in 2016, there was the argument for a lot of people, myself included, I was one of these people, that said the Fury was a better buy, because you could get one used, or in my case, new old stock, for, if not the same price, even lower. and it performed on paper a lot better, and when it came to a lot of games, it performed better as well. But the thing is, time has passed, and the Fury has lost a lot of support that the RX 480 hasn't. It's limited to just 4GB of VRAM as its maximum, and we know VRAM is a big thing today, so 4 gigs versus 8 gigs, and architectural differences aside, this should make for a rather interesting comparison. But still, it was a lot of work throwing this video together, and it is quite technical and in-depth for a budget builds video. We're talking a lot of graphs, a lot of testing, and we want to settle this argument once and for all. Was the RX 480 a better buy than the R9 Fury, and how are both competing with each other after 9 years on the market in the benchmarks? Starting off the benchmarks, we have GTA 5, which we had here running with high settings and the 720p resolution, just to give us a baseline of how the cards compare at their very lowest of resolutions. And as we can see here, the RX 480 does ever so slightly edge out a win. Now, the R9 Fury series was never particularly good in lower resolutions, but it was quite the big win here for the RX 480, where we were seeing about 12 more FPS on average. It's only when we start moving things up to 1080p that we see the R9 Fury take the lead quite dramatically, as now it's actually getting to use its higher memory bus, and it does perform quite well in GTA 5 Enhanced Edition. It's not a major improvement, as both cards are definitely more than playable with the high settings we're using, but it's nice to see that the R9 Fury, when it's actually optimized for a title, which for some reason it is here with GTA 5 Enhanced, it handles it absolutely fantastically. Moving up to 1440p, and not much really changes. We still see that the RX 480 is now dropping under 60 FPS, but the R9 Fury is still maintaining well over 60 FPS while still using the 1440p settings. The biggest difference though is when we move things up to 4K, where the RX 480 is now getting around 31 FPS on average, which is still playable as long as you cap the frame rate, but the frame times as well aren't particularly fantastic. The same can be said for the frame times of the R9 Fury at 4K, but that's likely down to VRAM and not the card's actual power. In terms of its average FPS, we were still seeing 50 FPS at 4K using very high settings. So it is quite impressive to see that GTA 5, at least the Enhanced Edition, seems to be quite a big win for the R9 Fury. Moving on to Oblivion Remastered, we can see that in 720p with low settings, the RX 480 is actually achieving a remarkably decent frame rate. I mean, the game didn't look particularly fantastic, but it was seeing well over 80 FPS on average. This compares to the R9 Fury, where we were seeing around 16 FPS on average, and if you've seen the R9 Fury video, you'll know that we needed some particularly bad settings just to get the game even playable. So compared to GTA 5's performance, things here were not particularly great. Moving up to 1080p, and we still see that the RX 480 is still playable with low and medium settings, and was still running at over 35 FPS, so if you cap that frame rate, it's still playable on what is a mid-range 9-year-old card, whereas the R9 Fury, we're down to 10 FPS. So when you actually look at the performance here, the only way to actually make the game playable at all on the R9 Fury was 540p with low settings. Whereas the RX 480, well, you're getting a much better experience with a much better frame rate in a higher resolution with higher settings. So Oblivion, this is very clearly a win for the RX 480. Launching up Counter-Strike 2 with a mixture of competitive settings in 720p once again sees that both cards are capable of delivering really high frame rates, and whether it's to do with drivers or the overheads with them, it does seem that the RX 480 does take the win here. I mean, we're talking about 250 FPS versus just shy of 300, with decent frame times across both of them. In fact, the R9 Fury did actually have better frame times in 720p. When we start moving up to 1080p, we see things become virtually equal across the board, with the RX 480 ever so slightly better, but then it does reverse things more as we shift up to 1440p, which is the real territory for the R9 Fury. Still very similar performance, but it was a lot more stable on the R9 Fury, at least in terms of the overall average. And when we move up to 4K, we see that the R9 Fury really does take a little bit of a leap ahead again. Both are still very playable, and they do actually keep in line with each other. We're usually talking about 20 FPS difference maximum between both cards, and very similar frame times, with sometimes the RX 480 being a little bit better, but the R9 Fury also being better at other resolutions. It's one of those weird ones to test, but Counter-Strike 2 is about equal on the both. Really, the R9 Fury takes the win in terms of actual resolution advantage, but if you're playing at 1080p or 1440p, you're not going to see much of a difference. Now, Cyberpunk 2077 is an interesting one, as we did benchmark the game with the same settings on both cards where we used low textures and medium and high settings, which tended to be the best way to get the game looking and running rather good, as the effects and the shaders do tend to make up from the deficit of the texture resolution. When we started things off at 720p, once again it's a clear win for the RX 480, but as things progressed higher up the resolutions, we see that in 1080p the R9 Fury begins to pull ahead with 51 FPS on average, whereas the RX 480 is hovering around the mid-40s. Now, frame times technically were better on the RX 480, but the actual experience between the two was very comparable. It's only when we start moving even further up to 1440p that we see the R9 Fury becomes a lot more powerful than the RX 480, managing 40 FPS while still maintaining a 1440p resolution, whereas the RX 480 just dips under the level that I'd consider playable, at least without lowering a few more settings. When we move up to 4K, neither card is particularly playable, but then again, it is quite a recent title, and the RX 480 was never designed to run this at 4K, and the R9 Fury, well, let's be honest, it's got 4 gigs of VRAM, and that is really going to hamper things down at 4K, but it is on the cusp of being playable in certain situations. Either way, Cyberpunk 2077 is quite comparable up to 1080p, but the R9 Fury just takes the lead well after that. For Stalker 2, I'm just going to show you this one graph, as it was only in 720p when we used FSR set to the performance mode that we saw the RX 480 be slightly playable. In 1080p, neither card was playable at all, so really for Stalker 2, it doesn't matter whether using the RX 480, it doesn't matter what resolution you're really playing in, neither one is particularly enjoyable, especially given the amount of shimmering that FSR causes in this game. Yes, it does offer a sizable performance increase, and it's enough to make the Fury at least somewhat competitive in 720p, but the RX 480 really does take the win here, but neither are particularly great. Now, when running PUBG with higher settings in 720p, we see the RX 480 setting quite the lead with well over 100 FPS, whereas the R9 Fury, well, it's just not really hanging in there. I mean, it's still a very playable frame rate, but there's no comparison between them. The RX 480 is the undisputed winner here. Moving up to 1080p, it's a very similar story to what we've seen before, where the RX 480 is winning out, but the R9 Fury is closing in quite quickly, both seeing about 70 to 80 FPS on average, with rather decent 1% lows. Moving up to 1440p, once again we see the RX 480 mysteriously still winning in this game, which is something I wasn't expecting. Usually the R9 Fury takes over at this point, but the RX 480 was hanging in there with a really rather decent bit of performance and decent settings and resolution to boot. It's only when we moved up to 4K that suddenly everything shifts. The RX 480 it runs completely out of power to actually play the game here. It's maintaining over 30 FPS, but it was a lot more stable and a lot more enjoyable at 4K on the R9 Fury. Now, neither of these is a particularly great way of playing the game when 1440p ran so well, but it's nice to see that the R9 Fury, well, it's doing what it was designed to do. 4K gaming, whereas the RX 480 just can't hang in there. Now we have BeamNG here running with a mixture of high and ultra settings, and in 720p this is the first time that we saw the R9 Fury is just completely decimating the RX 480. It really does struggle with ultra settings here, whereas the R9 Fury just seems to pull ahead, even regardless of the fact it doesn't deal with 720p resolutions particularly well. Moving up to 1080p, and the gap only becomes more pronounced, with the RX 480 still being playable, but the R9 Fury being enjoyable, which is what you want to see. Moving up to 1440p once again, and the RX 480 suddenly stops being playable. Now, we are testing in the jungle map, which is where I like to do some of my more intensive graphics benchmarks, so in simpler maps it likely would be playable in the RX 480, but what matters more is the R9 Fury is still maintaining a rather decent frame rate in 1440p. In fact, it can actually manage the game at 4K. Now, we are seeing just over 30 FPS, and there was a slight bit of, hitching and stuttering in places on the R9 Fury, but it was nowhere near as bad as the RX 480, which was now running at 15 FPS, very much a PowerPoint tier. I wasn't expecting to test BeamNG and see it be such a win for the R9 Fury. Maybe it's the amount of draw calls it's doing, and the fact that the HBM memory on the R9 Fury is just that much superior, especially with that huge memory bus. But I've always found the R9 Fury cards do deal with BeamNG rather well. And it's nothing against the RX 480, it's completely stomped here by the older R9 Fury. Once again testing with ultra settings just to try and put as much strain on the cards as possible, given that Mount & Blade Bannerlord is incredibly well optimised. And in 720p both cards were playable, but it's a clear win for the RX 480, which is seeing well over 100 FPS, actually averaging 128 FPS on average, whereas the R9 Fury is returning just over 100 frames. Now, the frame times were a lot better on the R9 Fury, but in 720p when you're pushing these types of resolutions, well, you are better off either capping the frame rate or upping the resolution, really. Moving up to 1080p, and the reverse is seen. The RX 480 begins to struggle, and the R9 Fury is maintaining over 70 FPS on average. Moving on again up to 1440p, and the RX 480 is dipping into the realms of just about playable, whereas the R9 Fury is seeing over 60 FPS. And then once again in 4K, we see the R9 Fury. Its frame times are going a bit all over the place, but it is beating the RX 480 because at least it's playable and running at over 20 frames per second. So it was a bit of a weird set of scaling here. I mean, the RX 480 is very much as you'd expect, a linear way down, but the R9 Fury scales very weirdly, and here in 4K with ultra settings, it still maintains a decent degree of playability. So to begin rounding off our benchmarks, we do have City Skylines 2 running in medium settings with 720p, and immediately from the get-go we can see the RX 480 is majorly in the lead, and you'd pretty much be expecting it to follow the same course as most of the actual reviews we've done so far, where the R9 Fury is going to pull it back. But as you may note here, it is already running at just over 30 FPS. There's nothing really to claw back here. It doesn't deal well in City Skylines 2. So when we move things up to 1080p, well, the R9 Fury is dropping under the realms of playability at 20 FPS, whereas the RX 480 was just shy of 30, which is how I actually tried to play the game, and it was relatively playable like that given the genre it's from. Now, it is worth noting that in 1440p things do get a little bit more similar. The R9 Fury hasn't really been dropping too many frames as we've been increasing the resolution, but it's never actually been playable. The RX 480 stops being playable here, and then going up to 4K, we see the R9 Fury, we are now using 0.5s of a frame rate here just because of how abysmal the frame rates are in this game. But the R9 Fury did win. I don't know if it's really a win because you can't really call either of these playable, but your best chance of playing in 4K between the two cards was actually on the R9 Fury. So City Skylines 2, bit of a weird one there, and not one that performs particularly well, at least on the AMD graphics cards I've tested so far. Right, so performance across the benchmarks is rather interesting because when we look at the 720p performance, we see that generally the RX 480 is far superior, which means in terms of longevity, when you are eventually getting down to those 720p resolutions in the RX 480, which hasn't happened just yet, keep in mind, it is an alright 1080p card and you can still mess around with settings to make it usable. We've got an entire video on it. But it does perform better than the Fury, which lines up with the way things were near enough 9 years ago, where the Fury was always a good performing card at higher resolutions, but it just doesn't scale well beneath 1080p, it just doesn't work. When you move up to 1080p though, things do get a little bit more interesting. As we see, they sort of become equal in a few titles. I mean, Counter-Strike 2 is a win for the RX 480, Oblivion Remastered of course completely decimates things on the R9 Fury. I mean, the RX 480 here was running the game playably, whereas the Fury can't manage anything at all. and they're generally changing blows, they're doing alright between themselves. There's a couple of outliers where the sheer power of the Fury is offering you twice the performance, which is likely down to using ultra settings in a few things like BeamNG or Mountain Blade, but performance generally, it's pretty decent between the two. It's only when we start moving up to 1440p that we start seeing the Fury really taking a lead. There's only one game where the actual RX 480 was actually giving any form of competition, and that was in PUBG, which is, it's utilizing DirectX 12 better with the new API. It makes a lot more sense that it's going to perform better now. But it was the difference between playable and unplayable in a lot of titles with Cyberpunk, Mountain Blade. When you look at BeamNG in particular, we're seeing over twice the frame rate, and the Fury just powers through, which is something that the RX cards simply couldn't. When you go up to 4K though, it's very much a similar story where they're starting to become a little bit unplayable on the Fury card. I mean, these are quite intensive titles, but it's a better showing than the Polaris equivalent. Polaris equivalent, sorry. So, it's an interesting one, and just shows that resolution generally scales with the Fury still, but the RX 480 is showing that for 1080p and below, it is a much better card, offering a more reliable experience, especially in newer titles. Now, one interesting point in this argument is of course power consumption, because with the launch of the RX 480 and the RX 470, despite AMD pumping them completely full of too much voltage when they came out of the doors, well, they were a lot more efficient than the previous generations, given that the performance we've been seeing between these cards is actually quite comparable in certain situations, and out of the box, well, the RX 480 is using 143 watts. When you compare this to the R9 Nano, which uses 148, it doesn't seem too much of a difference, but then you look at the normal R9 Fury, the full R9 Fury with the add-in board cooler, and it is pushing near 300 watts of power consumption. Now, undervolting does help both cards. The Fury drops down sub 200 watts, so most people I know that had an R9 Fury do tend to run them like this, but the RX 480, when undervolted, drops to just north of 100 watts, and if you were to reduce the clock some more, and you could probably get away with very similar performance to a normal RX 480, you could probably see even more efficient power consumption than this. The R9 Nano is just an anomaly because it is offering flagship performance with a sub 150 watt envelope, and once again, you can push this lower. But it's nice to see that, it was a big point of progression for AMD in terms of power consumption, and a lesson that I think graphics card manufacturers could really take a lesson from today. So there we have it, the R9 Fury versus the RX 480, and hopefully an argument that is now settled nearly a decade later. And the people that were saying that the R9 Fury was a better buy than the RX 480, especially with how cheap they got as new old stock and used cards, well, up until recently they have been right. And it is a little bit difficult to call a winner because literally up until this year, the Fury has been able to beat the RX 480 in all games. And yes, it's got a 4GB memory limit and things like that, but the R9 Fury has just become useless overnight, whereas the RX 480, maybe it is that 8GB of RAM, maybe it is the better drivers, maybe it's the architectural changes, but it is holding up a lot better in 2025, this year exactly, than R9 Fury does. So I'd say this year marks the turning point of when we're going to start seeing the RX 480 having been the better buy. Because the RX 480's got this gradual decline in performance where it's following sort of a normal linear loss in performance over the years, and it can still run modern 2025 games in 1080p. But the Fury, as we just saw, it drops off a cliff edge. I think I'm going to call the R9 Fury the winner here, purely because when it does run the games, it does a better job. But for longevity's sake, well, the Polaris cards do have more VRAM and should get a few more years out of them, whereas the Fury, maybe we'll revisit them in the future, but it doesn't seem like they've got much life left. But then again, the Vega cards are getting awfully cheap, so maybe we'll look at them at some point. Either way, it's going to be a little while before we look at the R9 Fury again, and maybe we look at the RX 480 and some Polaris, that's the one. Pronunciations all over the place. Either way, this was a very data-heavy video, and I hope it settled an argument that's been going around for years. I've been meaning to make this video for a long time, and I've finally got around to doing it. Now I can collate all the data together. But thank you very much for watching, and good night.